Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. I've been talking a lot about turning points, and especially in the last couple of episodes I've been talking about the impact of understanding substance abuse disorders and what the impact on the individual, but also on, how can we talk to an adult member or friend or family member about what's going on for them when we suspect that there could be a problem with alcohol and or drugs. And in the last episode I talked a little bit, or I hinted at that I'm going to be talking about, the issue of growing up with someone with a substance abuse disorder. Now, many years ago when I started off as a therapist working in addictions, one of the areas that I got very interested in was what became known as adult children of alcoholics. Okay? Now, essentially what that implies, or what we mean by that term adult children, is adults who were raised in alcoholic homes. And they tend to exhibit very similar traits that reveal this sort of past abuse or neglect. Now, again, this is on a spectrum. We're not necessarily talking about, brutality or anything like that. Childhood trauma manifests in all sorts of different ways. And the extent and degree to which a person is affected is going to also sort of vary. The other issue is that we're not just talking about alcoholics. We really are talking about issues that impact on the formation of a healthy adult human being, personality, but also physically being well, and being also well in relationship. So we now have, over 30 years of research in this area. And when we talk about kids growing up in alcoholic homes, those issues are also common to children who grew up in homes where there were other types of dysfunction, other types of trauma. So some of the common ones are things like, chronic illness, behavioural addictions, so when there's some compulsive and obsessive, behaviours embedded in the family system. Things like overeating or gambling can be also issues. And when we talk about this, what the reference point really becomes is that issue of healthy versus unhealthy attachment between parent and child. Okay, so, that can happen also in families where there's absolutely no alcohol or drug abuse. As I said, overly strict or legalistic religious practices in a home can also create, childhood trauma. And we need to be cognizant of that. But for the time being, I just want to, in a sense, almost particularly choose to focus around alcohol because it is, so common in our community. As I said, when I started working in addictions, I wasn't just working with people with the substance abuse disorder. I was working with, partners of people with alcohol and drug problems. I was working with, kids, teenagers who were growing up in a family where that was a problem. And, as the topic today implies, I spent a lot of time working with people who grew up with an alcoholic parent, or sometimes two alcoholic parents. And I got really interested in that because quite often, a lot of times, the person wouldn't necessarily identify that there was a massive problem in the home. They would often present because they were in a relationship with someone who has a substance abuse problem. But, quite frequently when we started to unpack their childhood, there was a very strong connection between that and having a parent with an addiction. So let me talk a little bit about some of the characteristics. And a lot of these go back to Dr. Janet Wojtowicz, who passed away, but the model really sort of became prevalent in 1983, which was around the time when I was working in addictions, and I got, as I said, really curiously interested in that because, we knew in essence the statistics on substance abuse disorders within the population. Okay. So she described patterns that were fairly consistently common amongst kids growing up with alcoholics and other dysfunctional family systems. And so let me go through some of those. So one of the key things that I found absolutely, fascinating was a lot of the time they had difficult judging what normal is. Now, as a psychologist, the question of what is normal is often, either a very interesting academic question or, we need to look at it from an almost statistical point of view. But one of the things that surfaced when I was working with one person is that they had a very high tolerance to the unusual. And they would perceive some pretty out there behaviour as being perfectly acceptable. So that was one characteristic. The other part of it was that the adult child often has a great deal of difficulty in following a project through from beginning to end. They would also tend to lie when it would be just as easy to tell the truth. And that was always fascinating to me. Why lie when the truth is just as easy and, probably a lot more straightforward? They also exhibit a very strong sense of inner critic, and they judge themselves often really, really harshly. And it's often very difficult to get them to see what they're doing in that regard. Another characteristic is that they frequently have a great deal of difficulty just having fun. Their sense of seriousness about stuff is very intense. And with that, they often struggle with that sense of, am I good enough? So that's a really important dynamic in that. They also, by and large, have difficulty with intimate relationships because they really have never really experienced a healthy, intimate relationship themselves growing up. So moving into relationships as a late teen, early adult, and mature adult, they're benchmarks. The other thing is that the person tends to be stress-prone. In other words, they tend to overreact to changes over which they've got no control. And again, this kicks then back into the inner critic, the judge, who says you're not good enough, you're not competent enough, and so that sense of responsibility that they put on themselves increases almost exponentially. Now, the interesting characteristic, not everyone becomes super responsible. Some become, extremely irresponsible. And coming back to this issue about intimate relationships, they have a tendency in relationships, even when it's unhealthy, to be extraordinarily loyal, even when there is sufficient evidence that loyalty is undeserved. So part of the problem, really, if I'm going to break it down into, or if I put it into categories, succinct categories, is that there tends to be a very negative self-perception. There tends to be a struggle with adapting to change. there is a very distinct problem with attachment. So their attachment style is either ambivalent, anxious, or dismissive, highly dismissive. They're often very, very critical. If they're not critical of themselves, they're often very, very critical of others. So life becomes very difficult. And some people, some adult children, compensate for that with extreme defensive behaviours. So, for example, because they're often in a state of fear, they become authority figures that intimidate or frighten others. They're often rigidly self-sufficient rather than being able to reach out, for support and help. They won't do that. And so a turning point often for a person who's an adult child is when they recognise and the light bulb goes on, is that I can't do this on my own. I've actually I need to change, and I need some help with that change. So fear or anxiety that underlies within their personality structure often inhibits them and stops them from reaching out. And so this tendency to be critical of themselves and or others just keeps popping up. And it's really, I'm not talking about a moderate form of this. I'm actually talking about a level in which it is almost debilitating. So the idea for someone who's grown up in a dysfunctional family or as an adult child of an alcoholic is experiencing at some point that little insight that bursts into a flame where they recognise that they need to change. It's not about others needing to change, but they themselves need to change. And it's a struggle in many respects, because that change is not going to come easy. It requires, a level of insight that isn't just positive. It actually brings with it some pain. And I often reflect on this because, one of the things that I've certainly experienced is that idea that no pain, no gain. But because of how you grow up and this tolerance for the unusual, we're often, as an adult child, a little bit confused about what's what and how do I, start to unpack this. Sometimes the impetus is when a partner that we're in relationship with actually exhibits the very problem that we grew up with. I remember when I was working in addictions, I worked with this woman who had 3 marriages, and in each marriage, her partner turned out to have either an alcohol problem, a gambling problem, or both. And in one of the sessions, she said to me, "How can I be so stupid to miss these characteristics?" Now, in fairness to her, her first husband was, an active drinker when they met and they got together. She just thought he was drinking less than her dad, so, that actually was a pretty good benchmark for her, but didn't realise that not only was he being quite secretive, he was also very manipulative. So, for example, he would only drink in front of her a certain amount, but then would drink in secrecy. She ended up leaving him because the relationship got to a point where he was being highly aggressive and violent and emotionally manipulative, and she had a bit of time between relationships. And then she met this man who she thought was just absolutely wonderful. He was attentive, he gave her lots of approval and love and affection, and she just thought she'd found love forever after, until she discovered that money wasn't where it should be, and that progressively, instead of being able to, pay the bills and support the mortgage, they were financially strapped despite the fact that he was making a good living. He was earning a lot of money, but that money would go into gambling. And so she ended up getting to a point where she had no